Chapter 3.
You're all mine.
Mrs. Lippenstein threatened, inching her way closer to Zack as he tried his hardest to loosen the grip her magic had on him.
Now, don't move a muscle. This won't hurt a bit.
Mrs. Lippenstein cackled. She clawed her pointy finger closer, inches from his eyeball. Mom! Dad! Millie! Sophie! Somebody! Anybody! Wake up! Zack cried out, but it was no use. This was the end of the line for our hero. Zack? A familiar voice called out. Zack looked around. Huh? Zack? All of a sudden, Zack opened his eyes instantly, sitting up in his bed, gasping for air as though someone had been sitting on his chest. His mom jolted back from his vast movement. She placed her hands on his shoulders, sitting beside him, assuring his safety. Zack grasped her hand almost immediately. He was still so in shock. It took him a comfortable minute to realize where he was. Shh, shh, shh. You're okay, his mom whispered, pulling his head closer to her chest. Mom, it was... Zack struggled to answer, taking short breaths, trying to regain his conscience. It was just a dream, honey, his mom replied, rocking back and forth, holding him closely. Yeah, a dream, Zack said, letting out a sigh of relief. Just a dream. His mom placed her palm over his forehead. You're warm. I better take your temperature. She then left the room to get the thermometer. Zack sat there for a second, still catching his breath. He looked around the room in good confidence that it was, in fact, a dream. Yet, something wasn't sitting well with him. If it was a dream, why does it feel like I'm still asleep? That was one thought that crossed his mind. His mom came back into the room, humming some sort of classic tune, prancing around like a mom from a popular 60s sitcom. Here you go, dear. Zack's face said it all. He stared at his mom with a very oddly confused expression as his mom stuffed a thermometer into his mouth. Zack's mom gently slipped the thermometer out of his mouth with a gleeful look. My, oh my, 92? Appears it's nothing but soup in bed for you, young man. Young man? Zack thought. And since when does my mom let me stay home sick? Zack lied down, courtesy of his mother insisting he rest and stay home. He gave her a cheesy smile and waited till she closed the door to slip on some wrinkled clothes from the hamper, shoes, and climb out his window. He hopped down the gutter pipes, landing into the rose bush. Ow, 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 Zack screamed. He dusted himself off and picked out the thorns. Hearing the faint sound of his father's voice, Zack crept up to the window of the living room where they were, making sure they didn't see him through the window. All appeared fine as Zack figured that it was the perfect time to make himself scarce. Zack jumped on his bike and took off down the street like a speeding bullet. He pedaled and pedaled, faster and faster, leaving tire marks on every street corner. As Zack dashed through downtown, an idea occurred to him. Sophie. He decided to take a different route, one that headed in Sophie's direction. Zack sped to Sophie's house, hoping to catch her before she got to school. Zack rounded the corner. He immediately pulled up in front of Sophie's. He hopped off his bike quietly and walked his bike to the side of her house, leaning it against it. He wanted to make sure he wasn't seen by her parents, as they left to work around that same time. The door began to open. It sounded as though the hinges were about to fall off the door. Zack peeked his head around the side of the house, trying to get a glimpse of who was coming out the front door. When they finally emerged, it resembled Sophie's mom and dad. Except, something was different, more or less, with them. Her dad walked in a straight line, like a battery-operated robot, never breaking eye contact. Sophie's father, carrying his typical briefcase, dressed in a nice suit and topping the whole appearance with a pair of slick sunglasses. Her mother, on the other hand, waved him goodbye as she stood in the doorway with powder and assorted food stains on her apron, and her leg lifted halfway off the ground. Zack could only look on, keeping a close eye on the two of them. "What's happening here?" he uttered under his breath. He had seen enough. He waited there a little while longer before Sophie finally came out. "Whoa," Zack said, watching a girl who acted like Sophie, sounded like Sophie, but looked like Sophie from like another dimension. Hair tied back with a ribbon, a flowy dress, and a letterman's sweater with their school initials embroidered on the front. This wasn't the Sophie he knew. "Oh no, they got to her too," Zack mumbled, worried she had been brainwashed or something. Sophie grabbed a bag lunch from her mother and gave a kiss on the cheek and headed out the door with a smile so big it almost looked painful. Zack knew he had to get to the bottom of this. He waited a little while, making sure her mother closed the door before he caught up with Sophie. Later, "Sophie," Zack called out under his breath, trying to hide his whereabouts. Sophie looked around, unsure who was calling to her. "Sophie!" Zack called out again, a little stronger this time. Sophie turned around once again, looking high and low for who was calling to her. "Hello?" she asked. Zack reached out from behind the bushes and grabbed the handle part of Sophie's backpack, pulling her down to hide her from plain sight. "What the?" she gasped. Zack immediately covered Sophie's mouth in case she screamed out of fear. "Sophie, it's me, Zack," he said urgently. Sophie looked at him, tilting her head in confusion. "It's Zack. You know, your best friend. Or, well, former best friend. We never established what we were," Zack said. It was clear he was at a loss for words and was trying to say anything for her to recognize him. After almost what felt like an eternity of eerie silence, Sophie widened her smile creepily. She then lunged forward and punched Zack in the arm. Ow!" Zack cried. "What was that for?" Sophie swiped at Zack's hand to uncover her mouth. "I know who you are, dork. Why were you stalking me?" "I wouldn't call it stalking." "Oh no? What would you call sneaking around my house, spying on me?" "Observing?" Zack asked, trying to make it sound less creepy. Sophie shot Zack a look like she didn't believe him. "Right." Zack and Sophie stood up and dusted themselves off. "What were you doing there anyways?" she asked. I wanted to make sure you were okay, Zack replied, looking at Sophie with worry in his eyes. Why wouldn't I be? She asked. Zack didn't have an answer. He hadn't figured out what was going on so far, but he knew whatever it wasn't good. And he also knew he needed to protect Sophie. Sophie could see that Zack was genuinely concerned. Instead of responding with her normal, sarcastic remarks, she decided to be polite. I'm fine. My parents, on the other hand, are a whole different story. What do you mean? Zack asked, knowing full well what she meant. It's just... Never mind, it's nothing. Soph, you can tell me. Sophie hesitated at first, but then opened up. It started a couple days ago. It was a normal Sunday morning, as normal as it gets around here. Usually I'm woken up by my mom's pet parrot, Stevie, yapping his lips off at the butt crack of dawn. This time, things went a little differently. Oh, yeah? How so? Zack asked. Like baking muffins and being all normal. Like loving and warm. It's been sort of nice. For once. Sophie replied. Her parents had never exactly been the type of people who showed a lot of love or emotion, or to show any signs of a tender nature. So for Sophie, this new behavior was a nice change. I guess that's nice? I haven't even told you the weirdest thing. Those words, they sent chills down Zack's spine. If she didn't have his attention before, she definitely had it now. Well, it's just... I've been having some really strange dreams lately. Almost like... Sophie trailed off as she stared off into thin air. Like you were in another world? Zack interrupted. Sophie immediately looked up at Zack, her eyes widened in disbelief. How did you... 'Cause I've been having the same dreams. Back at school, things at Middleton had only begun. As Zack and Sophie entered the front doors, it appeared to look as though the school had almost been reprogrammed. The letters on the front of the school looked brand new. The coat of paint had been repolished. Teachers were dressed up in sweater vests and ties, and kids were all waiting in a single file line to enter the classrooms. There was no noise, no chaos. It appeared as though everything was perfect. Too perfect. Children, you'll be late for class, Mrs. Hershey said, appearing eerily silent behind Zack and Sophie, causing them to jump from the surprise. As Zack turned around to reply, his words were immediately stunted by the odd appearance of Mrs. Hershey. Normally, she was a very frumpy dressed and angrily toned kind of person. But today, she had on a long brown skirt that hung to her ankles, glasses with a chain connected to the back of her head, and a sweater vest with a plaid pattern. This was not the teacher Zack and Sophie knew. Miss Hershey? Are you okay? Sophie asked, concerned. Why, yes, Miss Hudson. I'm fine, Mrs. Hershey replied, bearing an abnormal smile, with her head tilted to one side, arms folded behind her back, never blinking once. Why do you ask? It's just, what, dear? Mrs. Hershey insisted, shooting a step closer to Zack and Sophie, making them take a couple steps back for precaution. Nothing, Zack chimed in, stepping in front of Sophie, creating space between them and Mrs. Hershey. We were just on our way to class. Zack grabbed Sophie and started down the halls as fast as he could. Looking back every few seconds, he noticed Miss Hershey standing there in the halls, never taking her eye off of them once. That was weird, Sophie said. You could say that again, Zack replied comically. Just then, the two rounded the corner. They were immediately met by a group of their fellow schoolmates, standing in a herd, blocking the hallway. Zack and Sophie stopped in their tracks. After a few seconds, Zack spoke up. Hey guys, where's the beef? No one responded. Instead, the horde of students didn't do anything but leer and keep a focus on the two. Sophie and Zack looked at one another and then back at the group of kids. Sophie decided to try her approach. Yo guys, move it or lose it. That panned out as well as Zack's comment. We'll just go around, Zack said, tugging Sophie's arm. The two turned around and went back the way in which they had came. As they headed back the way they came, they remembered that Mrs. Hershey was there. Zack looked over and noticed the doors to the gym just a few feet away. This way. Zack and Sophie burst through the doors of the gym. There, the rest of the faculty and student bodies stood like a gang of factory robots, standing there in a row, waiting to be told what to do. Sophie looked around at everyone. She couldn't believe that this was actually happening. Zack had the same reaction. They both started to back away.
That'll be far enough, young man.
The voice to blow cold in anyone's blood, able to raise the hair on anyone's neck in a 50-mile radius, was all too familiar. Zack and Sophie froze when they heard her call to them. They felt her breath of death upon their necks. Miss Lippenstein, Zack and Sophie announced at the same time, turning to face her with the clear dread spread across their faces.
You're just in time for detention,
Mrs. Lippenstein declared, twirling her fingers between one another. Can't you find, a better catchphrase? Sophie said, not impressed.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't exactly have a book of clever evil catchphrases lying around,
Mrs. Lippenstein barked, rolling her eyes. To be fair, you have had a gajillion years to think of one? Zack stated.
A gajillion years? How long do you think I've been gone?
I don't know. A gajillion?
Enough of this. It's time for detention. Okay, I heard it that time.
Miss Lippenstein led the horde of faculty and students down the hall and through the corridors with haste, having Sophie and Zack not far behind, closely escorted by some of the students. "Why are you doing this?" Sophie asked, frantic.
You'll see.
Miss Lippenstein replied with a menacing tongue. "I don't get it. How could this be real? I mean, you died a long time ago. How could this be possible?"
It's simple, really. That night you came to visit the school?
"Yeah."
Well, turns out that you were right about one thing. A ghost reflection is our kryptonite. But what you didn't realize is you helped me escape all along.
"What? How?"
Turns out, your little doohickey thingamabobber you had the other night.
"My video camera?"
Mm-hmm. Yes, that contraption. Well, turns out that inside that little nifty machine of yours lied a little compartment that enabled me to transfer myself in, hiding behind, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike.
Zack looked at Miss Lippenstein. Then he attempted to reply, but befuddled his words and just stared again. "You'll have to explain that slower. Zack reads at a 4th grade level," Sophie said, patting Zack on the shoulder. Miss Lippenstein scoffed.
For goodness sake, your camera thing has a door that let me into your world.
"Oh, gotcha," Zack said, winking and giving a thumbs up to Miss Lippenstein. They then continued on to the room for detention. When they walked down the halls, the glimmer from the moonlight caught Sophie's attention. Thinking quickly on her feet, she threw herself to the floor, pretending she had sprained her ankle. "Ah! Oh, my ankle!" Sophie cried out, overacting, rubbing her foot. Miss Lippenstein stopped in her tracks. Against her better judgment, she turned to check on Sophie's claim. The other guards to Zack didn't leave his side. They just leaned forward, trying to get a better angle. Sophie and Zack made eye contact. Despite all the bodies standing around, the two had become so close over the years that at some point, they even thought they may have been able to read each other's thoughts. This was one of those times. As Sophie, without uttering even a sound, looked over at Zack and hinted by winking and looking towards the front door. Once Zack knew what she was hinting at, he snuck around the group, who had clearly started to turn into mindless drones, and tiptoed to the glass doors. "Hey! Over here!" Zack shouted. Like clockwork, the mindless creatures all turned to look at Zack, including Miss Lippenstein. Zack jumped to the side, allowing the beam of light from the moon shine inside, causing the drones and Miss Lippenstein to cower in fear from the light. Sophie sprang to her feet. Her and Zack bolted towards the doors to escape, but their angst was shut off when the doors wouldn't budge. "This way," Zack said, running back towards the drones and Miss Lippenstein, who were still cowering from the moonlight. Sophie following close behind. Zack and Sophie ran down a hall that was met with a dead end. The two panicked trying to find a way out, but there was nowhere to go, so they turned back the way they came. Unfortunately, Miss Lippenstein and the rest of her goons were standing at the other end of that hall, ready for them. "Got any more bright ideas?" Sophie demanded. I'm thinking. Zack replied, sheepishly backing away. Just then, he looked up and noticed the air vent. Look! Come on, give me a lift. Sophie gives him the "you're kidding me, right?" type of look. Allow me, Zack said, kneeling down while Sophie placed her foot in his lap and then boosted herself up. Once she was stable, Sophie reached her hand out and pulled Zack up. Which way? He asked. Sophie took a second to look around. She looked to her left. This way. She led Zack down a maze of tunnels, trying to get to safety. Finally, she found the janitor's closet. Here! Sophie lowered herself into the closet room. She helped Zack down after. She opened the door and peeked her head out, checking if the coast is clear. Okay, we're good. Zack and Sophie found the front of the school doors loose. They squeezed through. A sigh of relief that they had escaped. Whew. That was close, Sophie said. Zack shook his head, agreeing. As our two heroes were ecstatic to know they managed to escape the evil Miss Lippenstein's grasp, they were unaware that she was there in the shadows of the halls, lurking and waiting for them.
Close indeed.
Hey everybody, this is Griffin O'Connor. You were just listening to Chapter 3. We are already halfway through the season. I know, I can't believe it either. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing and listening to the official ZACK vs the Paranormal podcast channel right here on Anchor. Make sure to tell your friends, tell your friends' friends, tell your parents' friends. Tell everyone you can. Get out there, just yell it from all across the world. Now, I don't know, maybe. Anyway, thank you guys again for listening. Make sure you are subscribed. Make sure to leave us a review, a comment, a like, whatever it is. Just make sure you're letting us know how much you're digging this show so far, okay? And I will see you guys same ZACK time, same ZACK channel next Wednesday, 8 p.m. Pacific time.